and turned to constructionalization, so more currently, we've been working with constructionalization a bit more. I'm talking about an important group, but all over the territory, of course, things are maybe different. But anyway, the theoretical, orientation is, in a good extent, is quite the same. So
yeah.
It will be wonderful. Well,
Okay, we've got the thumbs up.
Have we?
I see it.
I don't.
Oh.
Well,
there's a box that says Abralin ao vivo. Oh, now the thumbs up has gone away, but
Roberto, you can start.
Okay.
Thank you, Miguel. So, good afternoon. My name is Roberto Freitas. I'm a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I'm very pleased to be joining this important event from Abralin ao vivo, Linguists Online. That is an online event proposed by the Brazilian Linguistic Association in cooperation with several international associations, including the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistes, the Associação de Linguística e Filologia de América Latina, the Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, the Linguistic Society of America, the Societat Linguística Europeia, and the Linguistics Association of Great Britain. So we are happy to have Dr. Brian D. Joseph, that is a distinguished professor of linguistics at Ohio State University. Professor Brian earned his bachelor's degree in linguistics from Yale University, his master's and doctorates in linguistics from Harvard. He joined Ohio State's faculty in the Department of Linguistics and then joined the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Literatures. So his most important areas of expertise are historical linguistics, history of Greek, language contact, Greek, Albanian, Balkan linguistics, and Sanskrit studies. Dr. Joseph is going to offer us an important lecture. The title of this lecture, as you probably have noticed, is What Grammaticalization is and What It's Not, Some Observations. After his speech, we invite you, the audience, to participate in the forum with the chat by making questions. We are going to try to pick some questions so Dr. Joseph can answer and we can conduct the debate. So, Dr. Brian, the floor is yours. Thank you once again, for giving us such wonderful opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Roberto, and for this very kind and introduction. Let me first of all say bom dia a todos, and hello, hola, yasas, and mirdita to my friends all around the world. I'm coming to you live from my family room. You can see it here. This is just to give you a bit of context. This is where I've been spending most of my time in the last 8 weeks, sitting on this couch and interacting with people by Zoom. But it's not unreasonable. But I will switch actually to a background that is maybe a little more suitable for our talk today. There. So this is the Indo-European family tree behind me. So don't usually mix politics with my linguistics, but we are in unusual times right now. So I feel that it's important. I feel compelled almost to start with a few words of a non-linguistic nature, though they will tie in ultimately. I'm going to start sharing my screen, though. Hang on just a moment. This is my the talk, the slides for the talk that I'll be doing. So as I say, I don't usually mix politics with my linguistics, but unusual times call for unusual steps. And these unusual times are very difficult times, I think, for various reasons, and in various places all around the world, from the effects of the coronavirus in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, to the effects of racial injustice, a different kind of virus in a way, in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, including St. Paul, the counterpart to Sao Paulo in certain respects, linguistically at least. So the coronavirus, the coronavirus, I think, tells us that lives matter, and the racial injustice that we've seen in Minneapolis, St. Paul, tells us that Black lives matter. And linguistics in general teaches us that words matter, that the words that we say, the ways in which we say things, the metaphors that we use, all give a picture of how we think about the events and that are taking place and affecting us in the world. But I'd like to turn now to my more linguistic goals for today. I hope to show by doing so that science matters, and that the fine-grained analysis that the scientific method gives us can lead to greater insight and wisdom, which is something that we can all benefit from in any time that we might find ourselves. So let me move on to the main topic at hand. I think, as many of you know, I have a bit of a reputation for being anti-grammaticalization based on several papers and presentations I've done in the last almost 20 years now. And my observations today are informed by that skepticism that I've shown. But I want to make clear that my skepticism is not about grammaticalization per se, but really about some of the claims that have been made within grammaticalization studies. And that's what I'll be outlining and discussing today. So I start with what might be, I trust, a fairly neutral characterization of grammaticalization. And that is, it represents the embedding into grammar, sort of the taking on of grammatical status of once non or less grammatical phenomena. And notice I don't say the process by which there is embedding, because in my view, which is one not shared by everyone, but in my view, one thing that grammaticalization is a process. It is not a mechanism of change. Rather, for me, grammaticalization is a result, a state that comes into existence through the action of well-known processes and mechanisms of language change, specifically regular sound change, borrowing, representing various contact-induced effects, and analogy. And I include under analogy the metaphorical shift in meaning. I treat that as a kind of semantic analogy. But grammaticalization is also used as a cover term for grammaticalization studies, that is, for work that's done within a framework that takes grammaticalization as its leading idea. And it's for that reason that it's important to consider what grammaticalization is and is not, hence my observations today. So one view of what grammaticalization is that it's essentially a type of internal reconstruction. And in order to understand what internal reconstruction is, let us consider this scenario. Suppose we enter a classroom. We're not doing much of that these days, but a real classroom in the olden days, a physical classroom. And we notice that the desks and the chairs are all in a different place from the way they had been before. And we think, how do we explain this? And we could, but just by using our reasoning, say, well, the movement of the furniture could have been caused by aliens, perhaps, entering the room and doing something. A windstorm blowing things around. Or the chairs could have been staging a rebellion against the desks that had been oppressing them, and they marched on them, moved things around. Or another teacher was rearranging the furniture in the classroom in order to offer a setting for a movie, or to stage a play, or just to promote discussion in his or her class. These are all possible scenarios, possible, and I emphasize that, but not all of them are equally plausible, and some can be ruled out rather easily, actually. Chairs are not capable of holding the propositional attitudes or carrying out the actions that would be necessary for staging a rebellion. So that one we can rule out. Visits by extraterrestrials are highly unlikely. And even if they did visit, why would they pull a prank like changing around the furniture? So that's a relatively improbable scenario. A windstorm could indeed wreak havoc in a room if the windows were left open or were blown out, but that's not a likely event. And in any case, the absence of broken glass would allow one to eliminate that possibility. So that leaves the best hypothesis remaining as the one that explains the alterations as the result of human actions sometime before we entered the classroom. In this exercise, we're somewhat in the position of Sherlock Holmes, who in the Sign of the Four and some other cases said, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Here we have been ruling out the impossible, the aliens, the windstorm, and so forth. And what we're left with, though in this case, it's not really improbable, but what we're left with is something that makes perfect sense as an explanation, one that is rooted in unobserved history, but derives from powers of deduction. So the basic structure of this exercise with internal reconstruction, and I would argue with grammaticalization in many instances, is trying to deduce the historical events that led to a synchronic state, guided by our sense of what are likely and unlikely events that could have created the observed synchronic state of affairs. Other instances of this mode of inference are quite common in daily life. We see, for instance, a puddle or wet pavement in the morning, and we can hypothesize that it rained overnight, even if we didn't directly experience the rain. We see a friend's hair in disarray and guess that he lost his comb, or he was just outside in a strong wind that blew his hair all over, and so on. In each case, we're attempting to reconstruct some aspect of the past that is not directly observable, but which rather is inferable from the outcome and from what we know about how such outcomes generally arise. When we apply this to language, this mode of reasoning gives us internal reconstruction, hypothesizing about the causal historical underpinnings to a particular configuration of facts in a language, with the most reasonable hypotheses being those that are supported by what's known about language and about language history and language change in general. Now, in a grammaticalization-based exploration of how some grammatical element has developed, we generally have to fill in gaps in the historical record. William Labov, in 1994, talked about this very exercise and by saying that historical linguistics is the art of, quote, the art of making the most of bad data. Though Rich Jonda and I in 2003 suggested that we substitute imperfect for bad. There isn't bad data, there can be, we just aren't in a situation where we have enough or data has to be interpreted that makes it imperfect. Bad data would be fake data, I suppose. So typically, though, we have an inkling, an idea of some sort that a given morpheme, a suffix, for instance, might have something to do etymologically or historically with some other morpheme, for instance, a free word. I take an example from Spanish, the adverbial marker mente, as in claramente, clearly, and the free word mente would seem to have some, meaning mind, would seem to have something to do with one another. But a full account would need to go beyond just observing that there could be a connection and try to motivate the connection in question. The guess here is that the starting point was phrasal forms like claramente, literally with a clear mind, a separate adjective clara and a separate noun mente, meaning clearly. That is, you do something with a clear mind, you're doing it clearly. That would link the adverbial use of the bound form to the lexical use of the free form. And such phrases do occur in adverbial usage in classical Latin, where mente is the ablative case form of the stem ment, meaning mind. Now, how might we strengthen this hypothesis? And at this point, it's just a hypothesis. Well, the recognition that the movement from a free word to an apparent affix via a starting point that is phrasal in nature is a common development cross-linguistically. So we draw on what we know about language change in general to make this a reasonable hypothesis. And we can observe, moreover, that this is in accord with the principle of unidirectionality that grammaticalization as a framework offers as a condition on grammatical change. By the principle of unidirectionality, what I mean is that movement involving the emergence of grammatical elements is unidirectional, always in the direction of going from a less grammatical element to a more grammatical element, where more and less are measured here on a cline, actually one that combines the cline of form, word affix, word clitic affix, phonological bulk, and one that involves functions such as lexical item, derivational affix, or inflectional affix. You put those together and you get something that looks somewhat like this: content item through clitic, through derivational, inflectional, affix, morphophonological process, phonological bulk. I'll talk a little more about this bulk in a moment. And this is a phonological bulk is a notion that Hopper in 1994 drew our attention to, and it really cycles back to content item. So once something is only phonological bulk, you're back here in the content item area. So it's a piece of content item, though, not a new content item. And this will become clearer with some of the examples we look at. Well, so far so good, going back to the claramente example, but then reality sets in. Old Spanish gives us not just phrases like claramente, but also claramiente and claramiente, along with a few other variants. It's also the case that from Latin mente, the expected outcome in later Spanish by regular sound change is miente with a diphthong, as in some of the Old Spanish forms like claramiente, as I show here. We can compare for this the modern Spanish viene, or comes from Latin venit, or pierdo, I lose, from the Latin root perd. What do these additional Old Spanish facts mean? Well, the ment form in both the free word and the adverb is not the straight line development out of Latin ment, neither in its free form nor in this phrasal combination that yielded the adverbial usage that we see. Rather, ment must represent a learned borrowing into Spanish, a cultismo, that replaced the regularly developing miente at some point. The R forms that we see in a form like miente have a different story altogether, involving analogical influence of adverbs in R. They're sort of out of the picture right now. But the ment form, claramente, and even the free form, mente, must represent these cultismos, learned borrowings. And if we think about it then, this learned borrowing interrupted the flow from the phrasal combination of Latin to the adverbial form of this variety of later Romance that we see in Spanish. In a sense, the borrowing started the devolution from word to affix via phrase all over again in the Middle Spanish period. That is, there wasn't a straight line development, straight line unidirectional movement from word to affix, but instead one that got interrupted by the reintroduction of a newly borrowed form into the adverbial and then backtracked. So it was not straight from word to affix, but rather something like this with a bit of a jog, word becoming something on the way to an affix, but not quite, and then reconstituting, resetting the developments from word into affix that we see. So the reality is actually somewhat different from what the internal reconstruction hypothesis based on modern Spanish mente as an adverbial marker and mente as a free form would suggest. So internally arrived at reconstructions can be wrong, or at least not completely right. But that's not really bad. In a sense, internal reconstruction is a hypothesis generating procedure, not a way of giving answers, but rather a way of offering possibilities to be explored further. I'd like to suggest that this is the situation with many analyses involving grammaticalization, that there are hypotheses that need to be tested further. An example from ancient Greek will show how we can go wrong with internal reconstruction. This is not grammaticalization per se, but this is just sort of a garden variety case of example of internal reconstruction. So based on a nominative form like onoma for name and a genitive form onomatos, meaning of a name, and putting it together with other nouns like meli, the word for honey, and melitos, the genitive form of honey, and also nouns like poimen for shepherd and poimenos for meaning of a shepherd, nominative and genitive in each instance. This gives us a basis for segmenting these as onomat os, melit os, and poimen os, the os marking the genitive. And from that, we can posit, looking just at these first two, we can posit melit as the nominative singular form historically, and onomat as the nominative singular form historically also. And that entails that there was a final stop deletion sound change that gave the attested forms onoma and meli. Now we can add in comparative external data outside of Greek in the words for honey that we find in Hittite, milit, and in Gothic, milith. And these confirm the internally arrived at reconstruction of melit in the case of honey with a T in the nominative form in this reconstructed phase of the language. But with regard to name, the comparison forms, the comparanda, are as follows. We find in Hittite laman, we find in Gothic nama, in Sanskrit nama, Latin nomen, and there are other forms as well. And importantly, there's no final T in any of these. Therefore, our reconstruction with onomat does not stand up to the external comparative evidence that we brought to bear on this issue. And that tells us that this reconstruction is wrong. It's not a viable reconstruction with a T here in the nominative. And at this point, we could note also, and perhaps we should have in doing this, that the denominative verbs, that is, verbs that are derived from nouns, from the nouns, these nouns in question, show different patterns. So we find blitto, to make honey, related to the melit word for honey, but we find onomaino, to name, related to onoma, the word for name. So there are different patterns for forming these denominative verbs. Blitto coming from lityo and onomaino coming from hmonyo. This shows that with a wider range of data taken into consideration internal to Greek, as here, or external to Greek, reconstructing onomat with a T as if it were parallel to melit simply is wrong. But that's okay. It's a hypothesis. We explore it, and we then judge or evaluate the hypothesis based on our further investigations. So as I said then, internal reconstruction offers a hypothesis that we can then look to falsify or confirm by considering more data. So we can wonder whether we're any better off with grammaticalization. The availability of claims such as those embodied in the principle of unidirectionality, to me, seems to invite almost a lack of caution. We can speculate our grammaticalization advocates may be too confident in their internal reconstruction results and hypotheses in an enterprise that's fraught with possibilities for missteps, as we've seen with the Spanish Claramente case and the Greek onoma case. All right, well, something that grammaticalization is not. I said it's like internal reconstruction, but what is it not? It's not a theory of morphology, or at least not much of a theory of morphology, despite the fact that it's interested in the origins of grammatical morphemes. I'm going to talk about Hopper again, his paper on phonogenesis and his analysis there of the English word handiwork. It's clear that it derives from Old English hand je work, where hand is the stem for hand. Okay, fair enough. And the g or y is a, sorry, that was my phone going off, is a derivational collective prefix that combines with werk to give the word for work that gives a meaning, a collection of work or a body of work. So handiwork is thus a collection of work done by hand. Okay. Now for modern English handiwork, the result of from regular sound changes from Old English handjework, Hand is the stem for hand, and work is the stem for work. And the E in Hopper's account just adds to the phonological bulk of the word. That is, it's synchronically non-morphemic. It just sort of builds up the word, bulks it up in a sense. Now, if we think for a moment about the principles of American structuralist morphological analysis, it involves looking for recurring partials of form that match recurring partials of meaning. So that means that we segment off hand in handiwork, and we segment off work in handiwork in the modern form, leaving the E in our segmentation. But it's also the case that another principle of the morphological analysis here was that there must be an exhaustive parsing of a word. All the pieces of form must be identified and accounted for. So that means we have to say that E is a morpheme. Now, it's admittedly a morpheme with no clear meaning, but if morphology is something that is an area of investigation that focuses on form, it's indeed possible to have morphemes that have no real meaning. In an alternative way, we could suggest that it finds its meaning in what it contributes to the combination of hand and work. Another example from English, we can consider the Old English first singular present indicative am of the verb to be, meaning I am. In Old English, much as in modern English with am, this seems to be unsegmentable. There's no basis for segmenting it into any internally demarcated pieces. So it's unsegmentable, much as am is in modern English. But interestingly, it was the source for an innovative first-person singular subjunctive form, beom, that replaced an earlier beo, and possibly even an innovative first singular form in one dialect for the rhyming word fleo, meaning to flee, thus fleom. So we can ask, I think, what is the status of eom morphologically at that point where we have beom and fleom? Clearly, once we have beom, and especially when there's also fleom, the principles of morphological analysis tell us that we have to segment off the M as a variant first-person singular marker. We'll come back to that in a moment, but keep that in mind. But I want to turn now to another example involving verbal inflection in modern Greek, an innovative type of verbal inflection, and the status of the pieces that are involved. The older paradigm for an end-stressed verb, such as ask, this is the ancient Greek contract verb class, such as ask, looked like this. First singular roto, second rotas, third person rota. An innovative singular paradigm that occurs dialectally for instance, in Epirus and in the Peloponnesus, and some of these forms occur in the standard language today. We find the first singular form, rotau, second singular rotais, and third singular rotai, where this innovative paradigm is based on the endings that are seen in root stressed verbs like kano, to do, where we have kano, kanis, kani, and it's these endings that parallel in the innovative form, rotau, rotais, rotai. So what is the segmentation of the innovative paradigm? It would be rotao, rotais, rotai, looking for recurring elements of form that match recurring elements of meaning. Historically, what happened is the third person singular form rota by itself, like this, was reanalyzed as a zero marked form, rota with a zero ending. So that the a has become part of the stem, and the paradigm has then been reconstituted with the productive endings o, is, and e from the related verb class, the root stressed verb class. This is a development that's known in the literature as Watkins' law, after the work of Calvert Watkins, who I'm very happy and pleased to be able to acknowledge as one of my mentors when I was doing my doctoral work. So it's based on Watkins's analysis of from 1962 of the origins of some Old Irish past tense formations. And there's here's a smattering of some of the relevant literature on the topic. So a new question that we can ask is, what is the status of "a" in the older paradigm and in the innovative paradigm from a morphological standpoint? In the older paradigm, where we had roto, rotas, rota, segmented like this, the "a" was the third person singular ending, and other forms that we could bring to bear on the segmentation are forms like the present of kano that we've seen, the past tense related to that, ekana, and so forth, that allows us to segment off the various morphological pieces, root and ending and such. But in the older paradigm, the "a" was part of the ending in the second and third person singular. Now the elements that spread are the o, is, and e. And that means that the "a" of third singular rotai is not part of the ending. The e is the ending in this innovative paradigm. Rather than rota is the stem to which these endings are added. So what do these examples show us then? First, let's go back to the handiwork and handiwork example. Here, there's little morphological change, if any. The meaning of the e has changed, but from what it was earlier, this collective marker, but the morphemic status of the piece between hand or hand and werk or work remains the same. It does not simply add to the phonological bulk of the word, but it has morphemic status. With regard to the Greek example with rota, the "a" is in the innovative paradigm is now part of the present stem, so that it's gone from being an inflectional ending in the earlier paradigm, it was the third singular ending, to being just a part of the stem that is mere morphological material. Now, this would appear to be an embarrassment if inflection is highly grammatical in nature and stem-related material, as with the "a" here, is less grammatical in nature. Now, this might not be so bad since "a" is merely part of the stem, not the whole stem itself. It adds, as Hopper puts it, to this phonological bulk. But the "a" is not mere morphological, phonological material in rotao, rotais, rotai. Rather, it has morphemic status. It isn't just adding to the bulk of the stem. It's different from its earlier status, though. In particular, the perfective stem that we see, for instance, in the aorist past tense, is rotis, as we have in, say, rotisa, I asked, so that the "a" in rotai, rotao, can be segmented off as the present imperfective stem marker. So it is involved in the formation of the imperfective stem. So morphologically, it's rota, root as the root, and the "a" as the imperfective stem deriving element, versus rotis, the perfective with the root ROT for ask, and the is as the perfective stem forming derivative marker. Now, if we go back now to our Old English eon, the third of our examples, we said that in Old English, when it was an isolated form, it was unsegmentable. There was no support for this M as being segmentable elsewhere in the inflectional system, or for that matter, with the L being the stem for B. So we would simply say that L was listed totally in the lexicon as a special form. And I think that's the right way of thinking about modern English. Am, for instance, it's just there, and the lexicon is a very particular irregularity. But once the M appears on beom, the subjunctive form, and phleum, the verb to flee, first person singular, then elm becomes analyzable as el with an M affix marking first person, The M then becomes segmentable. Once we have eom, beom, and phleom, the M becomes recognizable as associated with first person singular. It's recurring elements of form matching recurring elements of meaning. The M then becomes a separate morpheme, even if it's highly restricted to just a couple of verbs. So with both the A of rota and the M of eom, there's been a change of morphemic status over time. In the case of A, it's gone from an inflectional suffix to a derivational suffix deriving the aspectual stem. In the case of M, it has gone from being part of the arbitrary material, part of phonological bulk, really in Hopper's terms, in the lexical form of the first person singular, to being a morpheme, an inflectional suffix marking person and number. So what consequences are there for claims within grammaticalization and elsewhere from these analyses, these examples that I've been talking about? Hopper and Traugott, in their Cambridge textbook on grammaticalization, the first edition and the second edition, claim that there is a lexical source for all grammatical morphemes. So there's an issue here because eom shows that grammatical morphemes, the M here, can have other non-lexical sources. In this case, the spread of the M by analogy and the principles of morphological analysis combine to make M into a grammatical morpheme where it was just phonological material prior to these analogies. So it has moved, instead of moving in this direction on the cline that I had earlier, it's moving in this direction, backwards, as it were. There's also a consequence with regard to claims about language change being gradual, which is something that you can find in most treatments of the discussion of language change. The M here of eom, beom, really emerges abruptly as an inflectional affix without passing through a stage of being derivational, without moving in one direction on the cline at all. If we assume that derivation is less grammatical than inflection, then this would be lower on the grammaticality cline than inflection. But it emerges abruptly once you have eom all by itself for the longest time, and then once you have beom and then later phleom, we have this very abrupt creation of the M as an inflectional affix. The Greek case also challenges the claim that grammatical change is unidirectional, always in the direction of greater grammaticality, since the A in the Greek form rota goes from being inflectional, which is something that's more grammatical, to being derivational. It derives the stem, the new stem. And that's less grammatical, it's more lexical in nature. It derives a different aspectual stem. It's more tied to the development of lexical items. Now, the change from suffixal element to lexical does occur. We see this with the ism suffix, the historical suffix that can be used as a noun in expressions like socialism and other isms. The stan of various nation states in Central Asia can be used as a noun. You can hear discussion about the stands of Central Asia. And even ologist, for a medical specialist, can be used as an independent noun based on cardiologist, gynecologist, and the like. And we also have, we do have lexical material becoming just a mere piece of a word that does occur. So kappa for a cup of tea, or 2x for a 2x4 piece of wood. We could argue about that, whether the a in kappa is a morpheme or not, but that's a let's say a different issue from my concerns here. So we might say the rota development is not within the realm of grammaticalization, but rather is within the realm of lexicalization. And as a result, it would not be a counterexample to any claims about grammaticalization proper. But in my view, at least, this distinction between grammaticalization and lexicalization is somewhat specious. It really makes claims about grammaticalization basically untestable. And it's also not relevant here because this is not the creation of a new lexical item. And in any case, the a does have some grammatical value being involved in the derivation of a present imperfective stem. So I would say that this example with rota, the Greek inflectional case, is a true counterexample to claims about unidirectionality in grammatical change and poses a real problem, since it's often claimed that such counterexamples, it's recognized that there are such counterexamples, but it's usually claimed that they exhibit no pattern and are sporadic and unsystematic. And yet, as my earlier citation of various works on Watkins' law suggested, there are numerous examples that are reported in the literature that are just like this case of Greek, and each shows the same sort of morphological analysis. So there does seem to be something systematic going on in these counter-directional cases of that fall under the realm of Watkins' law. Another reason for being cautious about morphological analysis and claims about grammaticalization is that many discussions within the framework on grammaticalization have been inexplicit about the details of morphological and syntactic analysis. So English infinitival to, for instance, as in to walk, we can ask, what is it synchronically? We know that historically it was a preposition that governed a verbal noun. But in modern English, is it an infinitival marker, whatever that would be, whatever that means from a categorical point of view? Is it a particle? There's also questions that could be asked about the notion of particle from a categorical point of view. Is it a preposition? Maybe, but it's governing a verb, and that doesn't seem to be what prepositions usually do. Or is it something else? My favorite analysis is the one that Jeff Pullum put forward in 1982, that to is an auxiliary verb. And we do see auxiliary-like behavior as a verb phrase remnant in ellipsis. For instance, I offered to leave even though I didn't want to, where leave is elided, and the to remains, is just like I offered to leave even though I didn't know if I could leave. So to and could are similar remnants from VP ellipsis. There was other argumentation that Pullum gave. I thought it was a very compelling analysis. So my claim is that we can only have a real understanding of a historical development by understanding both the endpoints and the beginning points of an element's life. What we need really is a careful, synchronic, and theoretically well-informed analysis of each of those stages with the arguments and assumptions spelled out in detail. And I would say that only then can we say with confidence that, for instance, the Old English preposition to developed into an auxiliary verb. And that's why I say, and some of my students will recognize this, but that's why I say that in order to be a good historical linguist, you have to be a good linguist. And I offer you my T-shirt in the flesh, as it were, and in the photo. In order to be a good historical linguist, you have to be a good linguist. Now, after that diversion, we can get back to more on what grammaticalization is not. If grammaticalization in practice is best thought of as a type of internal reconstruction, then it's not really a theory of grammar in any full sense. Now, the issue of what a theory is, and complaints have been made by, for instance, by Fritz Neumeyer about the terminology grammaticalization theory, are perhaps ill-aimed in that no one has really made representations that it's a synchronic theory of grammar, or at least that has not taken hold very strongly. But there are links that have been made between the framework of grammaticalization and notions like emergent grammar. So it's not completely out of the realm of sort of theory formation at all. So we should not look to grammaticalization for a total theory or even a total account of language, excuse me, of language change. And let me sound a terminological note here, that using grammaticalization, as some people do, as a near synonym for change is, to me, a dangerous terminological step to take. It introduces a degree of vagueness and inexactitude in our discussion. So I would urge that we not do that. And part of the reason for that is that there's so much more to language change in historical linguistics than what the grammaticalization framework gives us. We know that language can change at all levels in all components. And I would say, actually, given enough time, perhaps there's nothing in language that cannot change, except for the most foundational aspects of language, the universal properties that make human language what it is. So in language as traditionally viewed, there's phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, lexicon, pragmatic interpretations given to the use of forms in discourse, and so forth. This means that there are sounds, there are patterns to the sound combinations, there's prosody, there are combination of sounds into these meaningful units we call morphemes, there are patterns for the combination of morphemes, word formation rules, and so on. There's a lot going on in language. All of that can change, I would say. All of the elements, all of the abstractions that govern the patterning of these elements, all of the combinatoric principles, all of the processes of interpretation, and so on, are subject to change. Now, how much of all of this do grammaticalization and grammaticalization studies cover? In a narrow sense, and this is what I would advocate, grammaticalization deals with just those aspects that constitute change in the direction of creating grammar, by which is meant, to judge from what is focused on in the literature, the creation of function morphemes, though derivational elements and discourse markers are routinely treated in grammaticalization-based discussions as well. And this is an interesting, I would say actually fascinating area of investigation, but it's not all there is to the study of language change. One area that is especially overlooked in grammaticalization studies is sound change. Why do I single out sound change? Well, it's the historical foundation of the field, historical linguistics narrowly, and linguistics more broadly, actually, via the discovery of the 19th century Neogrammarians, scholars such as Karl Brugmann, August Leskine, and Hermann Osthoff, and others as well. I realize these are dead white males, but they did remarkable work in the 19th century that built linguistics into what we know it to be today. The findings of the Neogrammarians and the consequences of these findings really stem from their most important proposal, which was that that sound change is purely phonetically conditioned and perfectly regular, totally exceptionless. And this led to this recognition that there is this kind of event involving sounds, led to the establishment of linguistics as a predictive science. It allowed scholars to make predictions as to what you should find, as we did with mente and miente early on in our Spanish example. And it led to the recognition that there are just three mechanisms of language change: sound change, analogy, and borrowing, taking borrowing to mean language contact effects more generally. These are the mechanisms of language change. And interestingly, these correspond to, and that's why I've color-coded them, to language as a physiological phenomenon. If sound change is phonetically determined, it's determined by the physiology of the vocal tract and the perception apparatus. Analogy corresponds to language as a cognitive phenomenon, and borrowing, language contact, corresponds to language as a social phenomenon. Those are the three sort of the tripod that put together give us our understanding of human language. But there's even more in historical linguistics that's not covered. What about issues of language relatedness, language prehistory, the Wörter und Sachen sort of approach, philology, text interpretation, etymology, all of which we work with, and admittedly those with working in the framework of grammaticalization employ the results and the methods of these areas of investigation, but these are all critical aspects to our understanding of what's going on in any phenomenon that we might try to analyze. So we can wonder, I wonder at least, whether the intense interest that grammaticalization studies show in one type of historical grammatical development, namely the emergence of grammatical morphemes, does it skew the field of historical linguistics? We might ask, in a somewhat uncharitable way, I realize, whether historical linguistics can survive grammaticalization. Will the rest of historical linguistics remain if grammaticalization expands its domain so much? Can we afford to give up on the foundational notion of regularity and phonetic-only conditioning of sound change, which interestingly, grammaticalization generally does not recognize? They talk about construction or lexeme-specific sound changes in many instances. What would we be left with then in terms of principled bases for making decisions about possible analyses. If we fail to adhere to the Neogrammarian doctrine and adopt the grammaticalizationist view of construction or lexeme-specific sound change, I would say maybe we'd have nothing, and therefore I emphasize the need for staying with the Neogrammarian Ausnahmslosigkeit, the exceptionlessness of sound change as a foundation for our investigations, a principled basis for our investigations. So by way of concluding, let me say that grammaticalization, when viewed properly and suitably enhanced with notions from traditional historical linguistics, certainly enriches our field. But there's more to historical linguistics and even more to grammatical change and development than just what is recognized within grammatical, sort of orthodox grammaticalization studies. So a clear idea of what grammaticalization is and what it is not, I believe, advances the cause of historical linguistics more generally. So let me say thank you and obrigado to you. And now I guess we're ready for some questions. Roberto is here, and I am ready for anything you guys throw at me.
Yes, we are. We have a couple of questions here. Maybe, well, let me see. So first of all, I would like to mention, I think it's worth mentioning, it's very important to mention, because you started your presentation making reference to some Spanish studies about the suffix mente, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what a coincidence, this is a very important subject. It's been a topic of study here in Brazil, and especially, at least that's what I can say, in the discourse and grammar research group. So our friend, Professor deceased and dearest Professor Mario Martellotta, he conducted many functionalist, very important studies on this subject. And currently, one of his students has just presented her doctoral thesis on the same topic. But now, as we were talking in the beginning, she's been working with the constructionalist approach. I think that this may be a subject for us to mention in 5 minutes, I believe.
Yeah.
Can I start?
I might, if I might just say, I didn't know the Portuguese facts. I was aware that there was something similar going on, but I didn't know the Portuguese facts, and I didn't want to dare touch on them without having a more solid empirical basis. This is great.
It was a wonderful coincidence, and I can tell you that we have a great deal of studies on grammaticalization about mente here in Brazil. Yeah. And now, not only on grammaticalization specifically, but turning into other theories like constructionalist approaches. And as I said, I guess that we have some questions. As I interpret them as part of two major blocks of questions. Yeah. Maybe the first block would be more centered on grammaticalization itself. Yeah. So we picked some questions here. Let me start with the question of Eduardo Moll. The question is, how can we analyze such morphological examples through the lenses of Gibbon's maxim that grammar influences discourse and discourse influences grammar?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, because I mean, what Gibbon has emphasized is that we can't take a sort of atomistic approach and just look at one little bit and one little bit and one little bit, even though that's what I was doing. But the relationship between grammar and discourse, to some extent, yes, grammar emerges out of discourse uses, but in my feeling, in my view, there must be something there to start with. It isn't just a random kind of set of forms that are thrown up for use in discourse, so that the kinds of developments that I looked at, the spread of the M, for instance, in the first person singular of the verb to be, spreading to other forms, we might imagine that I explained it in terms of analogy, but we might suppose as well that there would be a discourse pressures involving the use of the indicative and the use of the subjunctive overlapping to some extent, allowing for the influence of one form over the other. I focused just on the form, but if I don't know what a corpus study of Old English would show, but if indicative and subjunctive are sort of in the flow of the discourse, we could imagine that would be a discourse basis for some of the analogical influence that I was talking about. So it's not an area that I look at. I must say. I mean, I appreciate the perspective, but it's not something that I have spent time doing. So I focus more on matters of form rather than their discourse functions.
But you mentioned something very important. So you see, if I understood, grammaticalization is, a lot of things, but it's not exactly a theory of grammar. Yeah.
Right.
But
I would say.
Although it's absolutely related to the idea that grammar is emergent. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk a little about that?
Well, I guess it depends, right? So it depends what one means by a theory of grammar. And what I had in mind, I confess, was a somewhat what I guess many people would think of more as a structuralist or formalist approach rather than a purely functionalist approach. So when I talk about theory of grammar, I don't mean just how people use language, but what are the combinatorics? How do the building blocks get put together? And I think that any overall account of language will have to take that into consideration. So I was focusing on that end of things, and if instead we say, oh, it's all functional, it's all a matter of discourse usage and so forth, we're going to miss some of the sort of finer grained details of how words are actually formed, how they the combinatorics that go into giving us roots and stems and endings and such. So it's not that we often sort of see these as formalism and functionalism as kind of antagonistic, and I think they really have to go together. Why can't we all get along? So
there must be a model that will be able to deal with the both sides of the coin. Yeah,
we would hope. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here from Marcia Machado from FRJ. Considering the potential of change in the conventional association between certain meanings and linguistic forms, to what extent can we generalize over grammaticalization pathways and analogies at play in the linguistic change phenomena, mainly when we deal with diachronic reconstruction?
Yeah. So that I'd said at one point in talking about grammaticalization as a sort of internal reconstruction exercise, I said that typically we start with an idea of some sort. We have an inkling, we have some notion that there's some relationship, like with mente and claramente, and what I hoped to explicate in that, to demonstrate in that, was that it isn't just a matter of saying, oh, I recognize a relationship, my job is done. Rather, I recognize a potential interesting relationship. That's the starting point for my work rather than the end point of my work. So, so these pathways that have been identified within grammaticalization studies, sort of common pathways, give us a starting point. But I would say in each case, we have to sort of get as much of the data that we can to, and as we saw with the Latin, with the claramente example, there's a lot more going on than just the saying, oh, claramente shows the ablative of the free word mind. That there's a more detailed, a more nuanced kind of picture there. That a pathway like that gives us a starting point. We might say actually the traditional philological work, the etymological work, the recognition of sound change and as irregular sound change, what the outcome would be. All of those are pieces then that go into understanding what actually went on in the development of claramente from the Latin. I hope that answers the question, but that's, yeah.
It's okay with me. Well, let me see. Sebastian Carlos, Professor Sebastian Carlos, he asked, what is the status of the grammaticalization framework in the usage-based models, such as the theory of constructionalization and constructional change proposed by Traugott and Trousdale 2013? And then I guess we can start the second block of questions, because as I told you in the beginning, we have a huge amount of studies relying on grammaticalization here in Brazil, but we've been working a lot with constructionalization model, and some questions will be certainly about it.
Yeah. Well, let me put it in these terms. I presented the I mentioned the Neogrammarians and their recognition of sound change and analogy, and I it was partly a rhetorical device on my part, but I sort of set that in opposition to grammaticalization studies. But there's actually a very important way that ties into usage-based approaches. There's a very important way in which the Neogrammarian view of sound change and the more constructionally based views that are emerging from out of grammaticalization studies actually converge. And that is the following. Neogrammarian, the Neogrammarian view, by focusing on the phonetics of sound change, basically said that in essence, there's no word boundary effects that are part of sound change. We see sound changes sort of developing across word boundaries, and speakers then, in the Neogrammarian view, sort of analogically impose these higher levels of higher level constructions or higher level constructs like word boundaries on the form, and that changes the character. But in essence, in origin, sound change goes across word boundaries. We see that, for instance, in the Sundhi developments that Sanskrit is famous for, that they go across word boundaries. So the Neogrammarians actually then recognize that it isn't just a matter of looking at small units like words or morphemes, but you have to look at larger stretches of usage. You have to look at a form in a particular phrase, for instance. The phrasal prosody could make a difference for the way a sound develops. I think that's the case with the voicing that we find in English, the, this, and that, where in Old English it was voiceless, the. That sound change affected just these function words. That would look like an exception to Neogrammarian viewpoint. But if it has to do with the phrasal prosody, that is, if you look at a larger stretch. So I think there's actually then as I say, a matter of convergence between the Neogrammarian view of sound change over larger stretches beyond the word and a constructionalist more usage-based kind of approach. So if you look at words in their occurrence in phrases, in their occurrence in larger chunks of data, then we're really doing the same thing as a Neogrammarian and as a grammaticalizationist / constructionalist.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well. Heitor Bafa, what is your opinion about the duality that on one hand language change occurring any directionality going back and forth, and on the other hand the principle of least effort and the simple to complex theory?
Yeah. Well, I think if everything were a matter of least effort, then we would all be saying monosyllables like ba, 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 which wouldn't get us very far. So there's a balance that's necessary between not just the production, but also perception. So ease of production is one thing, but ease of perception, the desire to demarcate elements and to be sort of take a kind of Gricean point of view to produce utterances that can be interpreted appropriately. Those two are sort of competing forces in language, and we can't simply talk about a principle of least effort without recognizing that can present problems for perception. So, and I think that there are, to be sure, there are tendencies in the way language change develops. There are these pathways that grammaticalization has identified are evidence of that. But in particular cases, and this is where again a sort of usage-based approach comes into play. In particular instances, there can certainly be a reason for something to be analyzed in a different way, opposite to what is the more usual development, and that's the and I think, as the questioner recognizes, that's why we can get this sort of directionality. We can get things sort of backsliding and moving. It's not a straight line development like that, but sort of some fits and starts along the way, though ultimately the curve might be in a particular direction. As for simple and complex, the simple answer is that it's a complex question, if you will. And let me just say this: if we think of language change as simplifying, sure, but where does the complexity come from in the first place? And there also we can find examples of complexification as a result of language change. I think the introduction of the morpheme M for the first person singular, once we have in Old English, once we have eom, beom, fleom, is really a complication, because there was all of a sudden there's this new morpheme that is highly restricted in its distribution, and restricted distribution, I think by most measures would count as a complexity that's added to a system rather than a simplification. So there's a balance. It's a yin and yang kind of situation with language.
Okay, so it's still about this connection between diachrony and usage-based linguistics. We have a question from Professor Karen Sampaio. Assuming grammaticalization is not a process itself, but an epiphenomenon, how do you think the new achievements on usage-based linguistics can contribute to a better understanding of diachronic phenomena?
Yeah, wow. Big question. Yeah, so I mean, I'm an ardent Neogrammarian, I have to say that. And so the recognition of that there are three and only three mechanisms of change: sound change, analogy, and contact related phenomena. I really think that the way we make some progress is to see how far can we go with that, how far can we push that agenda, and where does it lead us to. And that's why I reject the notion of lexical diffusion, for instance, because I think that it would add another mechanism to our armamentarium, our bag of tools, when indeed we can explain most cases as lexical diffusion just by reference to analogy. So so considering, and that's what leads me to say that grammaticalization is a result. We find that result, but it's the processes that the Neogrammarians identified that lead us to those results. So in a usage-based approach, if I understand the question right, then it would be a matter of saying, so how do these processes play out in actual usage? And I mentioned if we look at broader stretches of speech constructions, for instance, then there can be prosodic effects that would be restricted to those constructions that could lead to what look like restricted sound changes, but are actually phonetically motivated sound changes over a stretch like that. So that I think there's not, it's not that we're at odds. The grammaticalization as an epiphenomenon is consistent with looking at or analyzing larger stretches of language that really emerge out of a usage-based approach. So I guess many of my answers are sort of coming back to the same.
Yeah, I guess we're talking about it all the time. Okay, so I have a bit different question,
Okay.
so we can change the subject a little. But I guess I want to go back to the discussion on constructionalization and
Sure.
grammaticalization. There is a question from Constantinus Sum, I guess that's the way you pronounce it. How do you see the rise of grammatical categories in, let's say, pidgins moving to creoles, which are not based on analogy or language contact?
Yeah. Well, first, my understanding of the relationship between pidgins and creoles is that it's not so much that a pidgin develops into a creole, but rather speakers expand the use of a pidgin, and this expanded usage, and this is again a usage-based kind of question, this expanded usage demands certain more apparatus, as it were, so that I don't see pidgins as developing into creoles per se, as has been suggested in Bickerton's approach. For instance, the children take a creole and embellish it. I think it's actually the adults who are embellishing it as they expand the domain of usage for a creole, for their mode of communication. So they draw on material that they have available to them, either within the pidgin itself or within one of the languages that they control in some other way, or that is controlled in the community in some other way, so that again, these processes of change would come into play. Analogy is a cognitive phenomenon. Metaphor as a type of semantically based, cognitively based analogy would come into play. And I think that's what we see in the ways in which pidgins get elaborated into more fully developed kinds of languages.
So it's a more cognitive process then.
I think, yeah. Though I have to confess that I'm very much of an amateur when it comes to creolistics.
Okay. Well, I have two questions from Professor Maria Maura Cesário, also from UFRJ. The grammaticalization model is predictive, but constructional models are not necessarily predictive. Can we say that this is a positive point for the theoretical model of grammaticalization? Is this a positive differential for this model?
Well, as I said with regard to the Neogrammarians, I think putting linguistic or historical linguistics on the level of being a predictive enterprise is what really changed it over into a scientific enterprise that has, we see in the last 150 years, has developed in this very interesting way. So to be predictive is good, but at the same time, you have to be able to make good predictions. The principle of unidirectionality would, on the one hand, seem to give us a basis for making all kinds of predictions, but if it isn't 100%, then if there are these counterexamples to it, then its predictive powers become somewhat less strong, and therefore, yes, it's good to be predictive, but you don't always get what you wish for, I suppose.
Salikoko Mafiwini. I doubt that grammaticalization can be conflated with the emergence of grammar. Do you think they are the same process?
Grammaticalization and grammar emergence. In sort of a narrow sense, grammaticalization, and this is, I would, in my discussion about a terminology, I guess I would say if we could restrict grammaticalization to talking just about the creation of grammatical elements, I would be very happy with that term. It's when you begin to expand the scope of grammaticalization to cover almost any change, then it's not really the it's going well beyond just the emergence of grammar. When I said emergence of grammar, I didn't mean so much the more technical sense of an emergent phenomenon. I meant the creation or the ways in which grammatical elements arise. So I think I would go along with Salikoko in suggesting that grammaticalization in a narrow sense is not emergent grammar writ large, but it has to do with the emergence of particular grammatical elements. Maybe that's a way of resolving the terminological element.
Okay.
Question.
Well, just one final question.
Sure.
Yeah. Also from Professor Maria Maura, it is the second question. So back to the constructionalization issue I mentioned. So constructionist analysis are increasingly gaining ground in linguistics. Do you think they diminish one of the main objectives of functional analysis, which was to seek motivating factors for the use of one or another structure? And she bases herself on the principle of iconicity.
Wow.
I don't know how familiar you are with this theory, but I understand you are enough familiar with it too.
I understand it well enough. The extent to which iconicity is involved, I can see that playing a role in word order. So I mean, something like, I mean, Behagel's ideas about words that go together semantically or functionally are grouped together syntactically. So there's an iconicity to word order. If certain word order patterns are a basis for some constructions, like topicalization sorts of constructions or question inversion constructions, then I could see that there's some convergence between the constructional perspective and the functional. That was what the question was asking about. So iconicity. So I think to the extent that iconicity can be involved in matters of word order, there could be then a point of similarity between constructional approaches and iconicity. Not all of word order is iconic. Not all of construction formation is iconic, but there can be.
It contemplates iconicity somehow.
There can be some complementary kinds of usage or functions there. Yeah.
Okay, I guess it is enough, right? The discussion was fun. Yeah, we don't want to get you tired.
No, that's fine. I love talking about this stuff. I just I don't always. It didn't always. I was expecting someone to ask me about a detail of Greek, and then I would be able to say, "Well, wait a minute. There's this, there's that." But all these questions were bigger issues that we certainly need to grapple with. Yeah.
But it was certainly wonderful anyway.
Good. Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and I'll have a look at the YouTube channel to see if there are other comments or questions that I can answer.
Please. The audience will be very happy with that.
Good.
We have people from different places in the world right now. People from Kansas, Chile, Lisbon, from Ohio University,
all right.
Vienna, Greece, Germany, Pavia, Nantes, France, Finland, Turkey, Los Angeles, Tirana, Düsseldorf, Montenegro, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, São Paulo, many other states and cities in Brazil. They are all with us right now. So thank you all, everybody, all the audience.
Yes, thank you.
I also would like to thank Professor Daisy Moraes, who has helped me with picking the questions and helping me with the technicalities here. And I would like to mention that it's important for everybody to try to be an associate of Abralin. Yeah, so it's very important that we support our association, that we follow its Instagram's account, the Facebook page, and all the social media they offer. Yeah, so be an associate. It's very important. And I would particularly like to thank you, Dr. Brian, for such wonderful opportunity to discuss all these issues and learn from your vast expertise.
Well, it was certainly an enjoyable experience for me too, I must say. So thank you all.